Hello everybody and welcome back. It is good to talk to all of you again today, and today is a slightly different Know Your Ship episode. One where I'm going to theorize what would happen in a fight between the Iowa and the Yamato. Now, this is a question that's been asked of me before, and I've never really done a video on it, so this is pretty much going to be my thoughts on this and why I think it's going to go one way or the other. Now obviously there's going to be some conditions attached to this fight. We're going to assume this fight occurs in 1944. Air power in the form of naval aviation from carriers is not going to be playing a role. The fight will occur at the beginning in ideal conditions, so calm seas, no visibility problems. Certain X factors, like let's say crew performance in terms of fire control or damage control, we'll just assume that they're equal in skill on both sides, even though I know historically America was better at damage control. So let's take a look at the sort of four major factors, and let's see how they do. First up, let's talk about firepower. The Iowa-class battleships were armed with 9 406mm 50 caliber guns, which fired the excellent Mark 8 Super Heavy shells. These shells came in at 1,225 kilograms, or 2,700 pounds. The shells could be fired to a maximum range of 38,720 meters, with a reload once every 30 seconds. The Iowas carried around 130 rounds per gun, although not all of it will be armor-piercing. The Yamato-class battleships were armed with the largest naval guns ever placed onto a warship, 9 460mm 45 caliber guns. It fired a 1,460 kilogram shell, or 3,219 pounds for those of you into the Imperial system, Type 91 armor-piercing shells. Now, these shells were specifically designed for underwater penetrations. Maximum range for the Yamato was around 41,870 meters, and the ship would be able to fire a salvo somewhere between 30 to 45 seconds depending on the range of the enemy ship. If the Iowa was at really far range, then the reload time would be a little bit longer, as the way the Yamato's guns were designed, they had to return to a certain position, and it took some time to get there. The Yamato carried roughly 100 shells per gun, although again, not all of it would be armor-piercing. In terms of actual penetration performance, both the Iowa's shells and the Yamato shells were actually quite similar to each other. Although it should be noted that the Yamato shells did carry a larger bursting charge, so in the event that the shell does penetrate through armor and explode, it should theoretically do more damage. The second factor is armor protection, and this is where the Iowa, I think, falls a little bit short. And yes, I know somebody is going to come out and say, but the Japanese armor wasn't of the same quality. I know, I'll get there, right? So typically battleships were designed with armor that will provide them with a sizable immunity zone against their own shells. Iowa had a 307mm main belt. Its deck armor consisted of 3 layers, a bomb deck that was 38mm thick, a main deck armor of 152mm, and a splinter deck below comprising of between 16 to 25mm, depending if it's over the machinery or the magazine. This armor scheme was designed to deal with the previous generation 406mm shells used in the US Navy, the Mark V shells. However, against the Mark 8 Super Heavy shells, the Iowa's protection was entirely insufficient, giving it a really tiny immunity zone between 21,580 meters and 25,000 meters roughly. This is actually the reason why the Montana-class battleships were designed, in order to have enough armor to resist these new Mark 8 shells. As Yamato's 460mm shells were basically on par with the Mark 8s in terms of penetration performance, it was just quite reasonably that the Iowa's armor protection would be insufficient in dealing with the Yamato shells. On the other hand, Yamato was designed with some degree of protection against her own shells. Her 410mm main belt, coupled with a 57mm upper deck armor, 200mm of main deck armor, gave her an immunity zone to her own shells between 20,000 and 30,000 meters. I do find this value actually reasonable, as if you were to look at the proposed specifications for the Montana with her 409mm belt and 38mm bomb deck and 179mm main deck armor was supposed to have an immunity zone against the super heavy 16-inch shell between 16,460 meters and 29,260 meters. The better quality of US steel being reflected here, having better vertical protection for roughly the same thickness, while offering almost the same degree of horizontal protection for far less thickness. Yamato's protection of her vitals, coupled with her turret face armor of 650mm, meant that her turrets would practically be impossible to take out in combat conditions, which means that in combat the Yamato should be able to resist the Iowa's shells, while the same could not be said about the Iowa resisting the Yamato's shells. The third factor we're going to talk about is speed, and this one is relatively simple. Iowa is a lot faster than the Yamato, going at full load 33 knots, while the Yamato was capable of a maximum of 27 knots. The speed advantage will allow the Iowa to engage when it wants, and in theory disengage when it wants. This should in theory allow the captain of the Iowa to engage at a time and a place that most favors his ship, while allowing him to disengage when the situation goes against him. Yamato does not have this luxury at all whatsoever, and pretty much, in a fight against the Iowa, the Yamato is basically going to have to go until either ammo has been fully expended or is able to close the distance down and finish off the Iowa in a range where the Yamato is going to be safe from the Iowa shells, but the Iowa is not going to be safe from the Yamato shells. And finally, the most interesting point to discuss, I think, when talking about this potential matchup is fire control. Now, the Iowa-class battleships was equipped with radar fire control. Now, this had a few obvious advantages, right? One, it allowed you to detect enemy ships early, so you won't get surprised. There's better ability to hit targets at range. It allowed the Iowa-class ships to maneuver while maintaining a firing solution. And there's one other thing, which is in poor visibility, radar has significant advantages over optics. While the Yamato was equipped with radar, it was not capable of being used to direct fire, right? Instead, the Yamato would depend on her excellent optics in an engagement, which under ideal conditions can still lead to hits at long range. I should point out that radar-directed fire control is not, and I repeat, is not an automatic I win button. If you take a look at the percentage chance of hitting a target at really long range, it is still not that high. Estimates of being able to hit a target, a battleship-sized target, at long range in excess of 30,000 meters, even with radar-directed fire control, is still in the low single-digit percentage range. Now, it definitely will be higher than optical fire control systems, which would probably be even in the lower single-digit percentage range, maybe even sub 1%. So, onto our theoretical engagement. Who would come out on top? Well, I would say Iowa potentially has the early advantage, being able to detect Yamato first with the Iowa's superior radar. Now, someone's going to say, yes, but, Yamato might have found Iowa earlier because Yamato has a superior number of scout planes, 7 on the Yamato compared to only 3 on the Iowa. But, it's kind of moot because there's no way the Yamato would have been able to move into a position to engage the Iowa without the Iowa detecting the Yamato on radar. So this numerical advantage in scout planes ends up in a draw, basically, right? So with the Yamato detected, the Iowa with her superior speed advantage now has to decide what to do. Engaging at long range is probably Iowa's best chance at getting her shells to penetrate and do damage, and potentially a lot of damage. And it's either that, kind of stay at long range, or close to a suicidal range under 20,000 meters, which in perfect daytime conditions is not going to happen. There is, of course, some evidence of the Iowa's ability to land shells near a ship at long range. In February 1944, the Japanese destroyer Nowaki was attempting to escape from 2 Iowa-class battleships, who engaged that destroyer at 32,000 meters in a chase. Now, both battleships were able to straddle the destroyer and cause some splinter damage. However, no hits were recorded, and the destroyer was able to escape. At roughly the same range, the Yamato was also able to straddle a target October 25th, 1944 off of Samar. Yamato opens fire on the USS White Plains at a range of 31,587 meters, and on her third salvo, a few minutes later, was able to straddle the ship. Now, assuming that the Iowa opts to stay at range and use her advantage in fire control to lob salvos at the Yamato while maneuvering, her expected percentage chance of hitting a target is probably going to be in the single-digit percentage range. And here's where I think luck will actually play the biggest role. If Iowa gets, let's say, really lucky and is able to hit 2% of her shells at long range, assuming she fires something like 1,000 shells, she'll land around 20 devastating hits, right? And 20 devastating hits might be enough to really damage the Yamato. And if she gets lucky and maybe one of the hits is to a magazine, then Yamato has a chance of being sunk. However, I am being optimistic with that 2% number. There's a good chance that at those kinds of ranges, the probability of a shell hit's actually below 1%. In that case, out of 1,000 shells, Iowa might manage single-digit hits. And in that kind of situation, like I said, unless Iowa gets really lucky and puts a shot into the Yamato's magazine, it's likely that the Iowa will expend all of its ammo before she's actually able to sink the Yamato. On the flip side, the Yamato, with her even worse fire control, will definitely struggle to hit Iowa. I'd expect probably no more than 4, maybe 5 hits after using up all of the Yamato's arm-piercing ammunition. And once again, luck is going to play a really big role here. A hit to the magazine will instantaneously be game over. A hit to the engine room has a chance of slowing the Iowa down, maybe so much so that the Yamato can catch up, close the range down, and finish off the Iowa in closer distances, at a distance where, hit percentages will go up. The Iowa's return fire wouldn't really hurt the Yamato, while the Yamato's fire will absolutely devastate the Iowa. In which case, in that scenario, Yamato might be able to sink the Iowa, right? So, in a scenario of trying to stay at long range while exchanging salvos, most of it's going to be down to luck. Now, if you were like, okay, you have to wager money on which one you think is going to win, I'd probably put the wager at something like 51, maybe 52 to 49, 48, 49, something like that. I wouldn't fully say 50-50 just because the Iowa does have that edge in fire control. But at this kind of range, at these extreme sort of long range situations, I'd put it down to luck. Alright, but what if we're not dealing with a long range engagement, right? What if there's a situation where the Iowa's captain engages the Yamato, but does so because of bad intelligence? Now remember, the US was not aware of how big the guns on the Yamatos were, right? What if the Iowa's captain believed that the ship was equipped with Japanese 41cm guns, firing a shell that would have been comparable to the older US Mark V shells? Shells that the Iowa had an immunity zone between 16,460 meters to 27,430 meters. A situation, for example, faced by Hood's commanding officer during her engagement with the Bismarck, when he tried to get the ship at maximum speed into his immunity zone, which most of you know ended up with disastrous results. If the Iowa had tried to close the distance and rushed in, it would have stood pretty much no chance against the Yamato. Between 20 and 30 kilometers, Yamato would have been essentially completely immune to Iowa shells, while Iowa would only been safe for a very small 4.5 kilometer zone between 21 and 25 kilometers. Furthermore, at these kinds of ranges, the number of hits increases quite dramatically, and Iowa's chances of survival drops quite dramatically, I would say. I'd have to give the advantage in this type of engagement decisively to the Yamato. The Iowa just really isn't going to stand a chance. Finally, no discussion of this topic can be complete without contemplating engagements at night or in poor visibility, or even poor sea states, which, out in the ocean is definitely possible. Although, in the Pacific, a little bit less likely than the more turbulent North Atlantic, right? And here, I think in those kinds of poor weather, poor visibility conditions, the advantage shifts quite dramatically in favor of the Iowa. Iowa's radar-directed fire control will allow it to engage the Yamato at a close enough distance to land very consistent hits, close enough where the hits will penetrate, while also just being sort of at that limit of what Yamato can do with its optical systems. During night engagements in particular, having radar and especially radar-directed fire control is a huge deal. America's two nighttime battleship engagements, Washington versus Kirishima, 7th Support Fleet versus Yamashiro, were both decisively in favor of the US Navy due to the advantage of radar-directed fire control. The engagement between the British battleship Duke of York and the German battleship Scharnhorst in heavy seas and really bad weather was once again decisively in favor of the side with the radar-directed fire control. So perhaps a smart Iowa captain might wait for nightfall before choosing to engage. Regardless, when it comes to night or poor visibility and bad weather, I pretty much will put that engagement decisively in favor of the Iowa, as Yamato's inability to come up with a firing solution with its primitive radar is really going to limit it in those kinds of scenarios. So, what's my final verdict? Well, I think it's a bit of a coin flip. At long ranges, neither ship really comes out on top unless they just get extremely lucky. At medium ranges, in perfect conditions, the fight swings in Yamato's favor, while in night or poor weather conditions, Iowa will reign supreme. Now do keep in mind that in a situation where the Yamato had to fight 2 Iowas, then I think the fight shifts dramatically in favor of the Iowa-class battleships, because after all, there were 4 Iowa-class battleships compared to only 2 Yamato-class battleships, so potentially it could have been a 2-on-1, and in that kind of situation, I struggle to see the Yamato coming out on top. So, what do you all think? Let me know who wins in your book. Also, are there any other theoretical scenarios you want me to look at between one warship and another? Let me know in the comments section below. One final thing before I take off is I want to give a big shout out and a huge amount of thanks to all my Patreon supporters. You guys are phenomenal. It's what allows me to make videos like this. So, just want to tell you guys I love you guys. Thank you all so much for your support. And of course, for those of you out there who want to support me, you can definitely check out my Patreon. The link is in the video description below. Other than that, folks, take care. Have yourselves a very good one, and I'll talk to all of you again next time.